Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the BECC webinar series. We're thrilled that you could all make it. And while we get started, let's just get our brains thinking about this topic. Could you put into the chat something that is different now than when you were young? How do you feel about the world now as compared to what you were thinking about when you were young? Let's get started thinking about this topic. Blockbusters are gone. Yeah, that's true, says Corey Farmer. What else is different about what you're thinking about in the world relative to when you were young? How do you think about the world? And we're just waiting for everybody else to file in while we talk here. Alyssa says she feels smothered about the future rather than hopeful or excited, which is sad, but true for a lot of people. Anybody else thinking about the overwhelming responsibility to make things better, says Randy. I didn't think about the world, and now I think about it all the time, says Lynn Dooley. And somebody's agreeing with that. Paula, regarding the future with dread instead of optimism. Sorry to hear that, but yes, that is what a lot of us are feeling. Eco-anxiety is real, says Therese. Honestly, I have more agency now than I thought when I was young. So that's great. I love that positivity. Thank you, Hannah. So today's webinar is about the climate crisis and Gen Z, or as we say in Canada, Gen Z, mental health screening and discussion. And before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about BECC, the webinar series. My name is Ruben Sussman, by the way. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program. That should be the Behavior Health and Human Dimensions program at ACEEE. I co-chair the BECC conference. I'm just one of many co-chairs and one of 3 convening organizations. This year's theme for BECC is driving transformation. And I wanted to make a note now that early bird registration is currently open. So you can head over right now to beccconference.org and register early and lock in the best rate. I also want to note that this year's conference has a virtual component, which you're attending right now, the virtual webinars. But we're also going to have the in-person component for the first time in many years. We'll be back in Sacramento, November 12th to 15th. So please join us there in person. Of course, we have to thank our sponsors. Without you, these webinar series and the actual conference itself would not be possible. So thank you very much. And if you are a sponsor, you're interested in having your name in front of many people, send me an email or send an email to info@beccconference.org and we can connect you. I also want to make a note before we get started that our next webinar is on May 17th. Shortly after this webinar, maybe within the next week, you'd probably be able to go over to beccconference.org and register for this. We're going to talk about improving public understanding of climate change by supporting weathercasters. Ed Maybach from George Mason University and Bernadette Woods-Plackey will be the 2 speakers for that one. Now, you guys have all been in many Zoom sessions since the pandemic began, but just to get things covered for the last time, I guess, please remain muted, but we'd love for you to turn on your webcam. Of course, you don't have to. Use the chat for questions and discussions throughout the webinar. I see that many people are already doing that. I'm going to be taking note of what's going on in the chat, and at the end of the session, we'll have plenty of time to run those questions by our panel. And so we're really excited for the discussion portion of this. I'm sure it'll be a very interesting and lively conversation. So let's get to today's webinar. Climate crisis and the Gen Z or Gen Z mental health. We'll have a movie screening and a discussion. Our moderator is Beth Carlin, and I'll turn it over to her now to introduce the rest of your speakers for today. Go ahead, Beth.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here. Thank you for joining. I'm really excited about this webinar. I know a lot of you, those of you who I don't, I'm excited to meet, hopefully engage with today. And I've been involved in the BECC community for over a decade, almost decade and a half now. And I'm really excited about today's webinar because I think the topic today is one that we're all aware of And we don't tackle directly that much in BECC. And I'm excited to kind of bring this to us because I think the behavior, energy, climate change, as a behavior, energy, climate change community, it's important that we keep front and center that in addition to all these maybe sometimes later, although when I started doing this work 20 years ago, it felt way more later than it does now, impacts of climate change, that there are mental health impacts having I can't talk, mental health impacts right now for all of us and especially young people. So that's what we're talking about today is climate change and youth and Gen Z mental health. And I'm excited to have three amazing speakers joining us. What we're going to do, here's our run of show. They're each going to speak for a few minutes and just talk about themselves and what brought them to this work. Then we're going to do something really exciting. We're going to share a short documentary film that Taya, the filmmaker, is with us, created with support, produced by the Climate Mental Health Network. We have the founder and executive director, Sarah Newman, here. Right before that, Larissa Dooley, who's a science advisor for the Climate Mental Health Network, is going to talk a little bit about some research she's been doing with, fortunately, myself, Sarah, and others kind of looking at what the data tell us. And then we're going to get really into stories and then try and leave the second half of our time together for a conversation with the filmmaker, with Sarah, with Larissa, and with you. As Reuven said, please stay active in that chat. I love that about virtual conferences that, like, you know, when you sit in a big room, you can't actually talk to all the people around you. We can, so feel free to do that. We will be engaging with all of you after the film. So, with that, I do want to introduce and let each of our speakers talk a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves, what brought them to this field, and kind of what they do. So we're going to start with Sarah Newman, who I said is the founder and director of the Climate Mental Health Network. I've known Sarah for a little over a decade, back in when she was at Participant Media running social action. So Sarah is not new at all to the idea of leveraging film and media for social impact. And so it seems so fitting that, of course, when you started Climate Mental Health Network, that making producing or being involved in sharing and documentary films was a huge part of what you would do. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the organization.
Thanks so much, Beth. And just thank you again to everyone for being here today. I'm just really grateful that we're having this conversation. And I'm going to be honest, I started this organization because I was struggling with climate anxiety and other emotions, grief, despair, you name it. And I could not find resources. I found a few, but it wasn't much. And I quickly realized that I'm not alone, that there's tens of millions of people just like myself who are struggling with the climate crisis from a mental health perspective, but didn't have or don't have the tools and resources they need. So I had this idea to start an organization and have had this great opportunity to work with Beth, Larissa, and Taya. And just in short, the organization has a very strong youth focus because young people disproportionately struggle with the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. And so we offer holistic programming that really centers the voices of youth, but is for many different populations that engage with youth, including teachers and parents. So looking forward to more after talking with all of you more afterwards.
Awesome. And next, we're gonna hear from our filmmaker, Taya. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taya. Thank you so much for being here. So I am a Gen Z climate activist. I'm also an environmental filmmaker. And the way I came to that as a storyteller is a little bit interesting. So I studied environmental studies in college. It's something that I've been kind of involved with my whole life. I started the environmental club at my high school, and climate and the environment has always been something on my mind. I've never really had the option for it not to be, unfortunately. But when I was in college, I started watching more documentaries and consuming more media as part of my courses. And I started thinking about how powerful film and media is as a tool for climate communication. And I ended up writing my thesis on the cultural impact and data from movies like WALL-E, like Blackfish, and like The Day After Tomorrow, whether good or bad in some of those climate science ways, but the cultural impact nonetheless of those films on us as a society. And I actually got into sustainable production, and now I'm really getting into filmmaking in the environmental space, and working with Climate Mental Health Network to make this documentary was kind of amazing to be able to combine like my own research background and my own passion for climate activism, and then storytelling, and being able to get these perspectives heard and on the big screen. And I'm also, I have a artist collective and production house, Strand Astronaut Productions, which worked with Climate Mental Health Network to create this film.
Awesome. And last, before we screen the film, we want to introduce Larissa Dooley, who's a science advisor to Climate Mental Health Network, and has been doing research on climate and mental health with a focus on youth. So I'm wondering if, Larissa, you can introduce yourself, what brought you to this work, and also share just a couple highlights from the research you've been doing before we launch into the film.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I'm so happy to be here and that this session is happening in this forum. So thank you for making it happen. As you mentioned, I'm lucky enough to work as a research scientist with Beth at Sea Change Institute, and I'm also a science advisor for the Climate Mental Health Network. I really delved into, my background is actually in health psychology, and when I had my daughter, I became very concerned about climate change, and also things were sort of ramping up in the news and in the wildfires that we were experiencing in California. And so it became more on my radar, and I decided I really wanted to use my skills and knowledge in behavioral science to help in whatever way I could shift this problem. So I started working with Sea Change, and really it was focused mostly on kind of mitigation, helping utility companies and businesses think about how to help message to their customers in ways to help save energy and reduce water use and things like that. And it wasn't until really in partnership with Climate Mental Health Network and funded by the Blue Shield of California that Sea Change was tasked with this job of really investigating the impacts of mental health or the impacts of climate change on mental health, in particular on young people. And so we were given this project 2 years ago, and that was really the start of my journey into the mental health impacts of climate change. And I was really startled by what I found, coming from thinking about, from a mitigation viewpoint, that really, yes, mental health is important. I am a psychologist. I definitely think mental health is important, but really, my true belief, I think, was that, what really needs to happen is we really need to kind of fix things. We really need to, do what we can to stop climate change. And of course, that's true. But at the same time, what I realized from this work was that the impacts on mental health were so big and so important and affecting so many people. And also that really they were incredibly relevant to mitigation, because emotions were really getting in the way of people's ability to act. I remember speaking to someone a few years ago who had just graduated from law school, and I said, what kind of law are you going to go into? And she said, I really haven't decided. And I said, oh, you should go into environmental law. And she said, oh, I'd love to do that, but I just can't. It's just too much of an emotional issue for me. And that really kind of drove it home for me that, like, the emotions that people are experiencing, the overwhelm, the grief, the sense of depression and loss, and all of these things are really getting in the way of people's ability to act. So it really kind of drove home in my mind this idea that, like, mental health is important because we really want people to, feel good and have a sense of well-being, but also because it's really important for, culturally, as, for our society at large to be able to act in an effective way and to kind of overcome the emotional barriers that may be preventing them from acting. To give you a little bit of background, just to kind of set up this film that you're gonna see, that will really kind of illustrate better than I can ever with just my words, but to kind of give you a research basis for that film, climate change has been declared an emergency by governments and medical associations and psychological associations and all kinds of foundations, but really the impacts have largely been focused on physical health impacts. And really, it wasn't until recently that there's been an increasing recognition that climate change has been profoundly affecting mental health, including depression, contributing to interruptions in sleep, anxiety, decreased life satisfaction, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress, all of these impacts. And really that mental and physical health are intertwined and influencing each other in a profound way, and sort of feed into one another. And there are really kind of two ways that, or two pathways primarily, that people really, their mental health can be impacted by climate change. The first one is directly. So we think about the direct impacts of climate change on mental health as being for people that have been directly impacted by a mental health, a climate change related disaster, a wildfire, a flood, a tornado. They've experienced probably significant losses, loss of life, loss of a loved one, a property, a loss of income due to that disaster, and those can have profound effects on mental health. So that's one kind of pathway that we see commonly in the literature, that people are really impacted psychologically by climate change. The other way is what we call the indirect impacts of climate change on mental health. And we're seeing this more and more, that really just knowing that climate change is happening, even if you haven't been directly impacted yet, just having an awareness that climate change is happening, reading about it, reading the IPCC report, looking at the headlines in the news, watching a flood or a wildfire play out on the news, learning about it in school for young people. All of these can be really tremendously troubling and have profound impacts on mental health. And we talk about it as kind of climate anxiety, but really there's a host of emotions that can be elicited by either these direct or indirect impacts of climate change on mental health. And the sad truth of it is that even though everyone has the capacity to be, and often is impacted in some way psychologically by climate change, young people really are kind of bearing the brunt of the mental health impacts. And this is for a few reasons: that their nervous systems are still developing for, kind of children and adolescents. Their emotion regulation capacities are still developing, so they don't they haven't yet developed the kind of skills to regulate their emotions that adults have. And also, the truth is that they're poised to bear the brunt of it. They're going to be living with the consequences of climate change longer than older adults. And so they're facing a harsher reality. So it makes sense that they would be more upset about it and exhibiting stronger mental health impacts. One of the studies that came out, I'm not sure if it's going to talk about this in the film, but there was a study by Carolyn Hickman and her colleagues. It was a global survey of 10,000 young people ages 16 to 24. And I think for a lot of people, this really raised a lot of red flags about the seriousness of the mental health impacts on young people. And it was 10 countries that were surveyed, including developing and developed countries. And they found that 75% of young people said the future is frightening. Just that alone, you kind of have to sit with that statistic for a minute and just let that sink in. A full 56% endorsed the statement that humanity is doomed. 55% felt that the things that they value most will be destroyed. So this, we're going to see it in the film, but really to let you know that from someone that has delved into the literature, and this is one study of many, many studies that have looked at the mental health impacts of climate change. There's a lot of evidence showing that the mental health of young people, as well as people across the spectrum of age, are being deeply impacted by the mental health impact, by climate change, direct impacts and indirect impacts. We also kind of, and this little summary on a higher note, we also, work to kind of develop a framework of strategies for coping with climate emotions. We found, we did a literature review and a landscape assessment of existing interventions. We talked to scholars and leading mental health practitioners in the field, and we found that there are really things that you can do to help build emotional resilience, to cope with your emotions in a more efficient and effective way, so that we're not debilitated by them, but can actually kind of move through those emotions and harness them towards action. So things like facing our feelings, using mindfulness and reframing, connecting with others, connecting with nature, engaging in climate action, and balancing that with self-care are all really effective things that we can do. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, but I want to turn it over and make sure we have time for the film. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Larissa. And I think one of the pieces in that framework is not looking away from climate emotions, right? Is accepting, processing, and sharing our stories. So with that, what a great introduction. Thank you all. We'll continue the conversation. Let's turn over to Taya's wonderful short documentary.
Last year, the UN described the current climate crisis as a code red for humanity.
I feel like I constantly see on the news about unprecedented fires and floods and hurricanes. I think about how people aren't going to be affected by these things equally.
It's sort of like picking at me. If you don't do this, then the world's going to end or something like that.
On a selfish level, I would like to have children, but with what I see at the moment, I'm not super sure it's a great idea.
It's becoming more unbearable for folks to be living in this part of the region and seeing how that's going to affect us in the future and what we can do now to stop that.
I think my biggest fear would be people will continue fighting against each other and finding things to fear instead of focusing how we can work together and create solutions and think positively and help each other.
All right. Well, let's take that in for a second. First of all, so we're going to start, we'll ask a few questions. We'll have a conversation with the speakers. And then again, we're going to open up to y'all. First, I just want to ask, Taya, like, tell us a little bit about your process. What were you trying to communicate? How did you find the speakers? You know, what was your goal and vision, and did it turn out the way you wanted it to?
Definitely. So this actually started as a project for a panel at the Hollywood Climate Summit last year in 2022. And the panel was on unpacking climate emotions. So Sarah and Samuel Rubin from Impact and Hollywood Climate Summit wanted to create something that really represented the youth perspective in this area. And so I was brought on to kind of take in all these videos and create a little bit of a story and a film out of it. So most of the people you see are actually Gen Z advisors of Climate Mental Health Network. They're all such incredible people and just had the most amazing things to say. We didn't even add in so much of what they're each individually doing. So I really encourage everyone to look them up and look up the organizations that they represent, which is their name tags and in association with. They're all doing such amazing things in sustainability, in energy justice, in just climate activism in general, climate cafes, art therapy, things like that. So just being able to bring these perspectives all together and formulate something that both really actualizes what young people are going through right now. It's difficult because we wanted to balance the doomism with what we can actually do to build emotional resilience. And that's how our interview questions really went, was starting with, what are your greatest fears? What are you scared of? What are you worried about? Towards what do you do to build emotional resilience in your life? What revives revives you emotionally. And we found a really common thread there with community action, community care, just putting a lot of emphasis on relationships and being able to talk to people about climate change and about their climate emotions was just something that was formulated through all of their stories, something that we saw as a really common tool for emotional resilience. And the balance there too is that there is a lot of burnout in the climate or the youth climate activist space. We're kind of, asked to come to a lot of things for free, like people are putting their own money to travel, things like that. So it's an emphasis on community care and really meaningful climate action rather than just kind of burning yourself out with every small thing you can do and letting it completely consume you with doom scrolling versus, actually looking for those solutions.
Awesome. And on that note of, balancing telling stories and affecting change, because we know they're correlated and not perfectly correlated. I wonder, Sarah, having spent a couple I don't want to date you, the better part of a couple decades, working at the intersection of media and social change. Tell me a little bit as the producer from your perspective, like, what made you want to do this, and what are your thoughts and how are you thinking about how we can leverage this film so that all the effort doesn't need to go on these activists in the film, right? Because I think that's the goal of a campaign, right? That's the goal of a film and communicating. So how are you thinking about making this and also building impact around it?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Yeah, and I did work in the media impact space for like 12 years. So it's something I'm really passionate about. And I just feel that this film, which I've seen, I don't know how many times now, I get very emotional about it every time I see it. And I just feel that when we're talking about climate and mental health, we need to be able to make this as accessible and tangible to people. And media through storytelling and media representation is one of the key ways to do that. People see this film and they say, I see myself on it. I see my child. I see anyone in their life. Like, it is so moving. And I think that it's not to dismiss all of the other work that needs to be done, but films really can change the world. They can change how people understand an issue. They can change how people think about an issue and how people engage. And so when we were doing this workshop, as Tay had mentioned, we knew that we wanted to do something to really elevate the issue of how climate mental health issues are impacting Gen Zers. And I think, Tay, it was like this film was made in like 8 days or something. It was done at lightning speed. And really what we're hoping with the film is that people host screenings in their communities, whether it's a workplace, a school, a local library, a house of worship, whatever it might be, as a way to help get this issue, to really spark conversations about this issue, for people to understand what is happening, why it's happening, and then what people can do. So we have a resource guide for people who host screenings, and then we have myriad resources on our website for people about, there's worksheets, tip sheets, books, podcast links, everything imaginable for people to be able to both practice self-care and develop more emotional well-being in the face of the climate crisis, and then also how to engage with community members. And, as the film eloquently shows, that connecting with community members is essential, but really using this film as that spark, as that initial way to start to engage people.
We're getting some questions about how do we get a copy? How much does it cost to host a screening? So can you talk a little bit about the screening and distribution, either or both of you, Tay and Sarah, like your thoughts on current and future goals and ideas for distribution of the film? How can people who are interested see it, screen it, share it, use it?
Thea, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are hosting a community screening campaign right now, which is mostly working with organizations and school curriculums. So you can fill out a host a screening campaign. We have a sliding scale fee there, so it really does depend on your event and just who you're trying to show it to. So if it's a small little classroom, we might give you a waiver fee for that and you can just show it. We also have a discussion toolkit that goes with it. I think it's really important to follow the film with a strong discussion, and we give a lot of tips and resources there. Especially we've had a couple middle and high school showings at their clubs or in their classrooms, and they bring in the school counselor to really lead a discussion on climate emotions. I think that's been one of the most impactful ones for our impact campaign. I really love seeing the balance of, anger and anxiety, and then climate joy and hope. And then we also post all of the public screenings on our page, climatementalhealth.net/Gen Z film. So you can follow along there, and there will be webinars like this where you can see it there. And then come fall time around then, we'll be distributing on a couple environmental platforms. So it will be available soon outside of the screening campaign.
Awesome. So let's turn from the logistics back into the stories themselves. I have a question from the audience that we can just kick off, because I think it's great, because I wanted to start kind of talking about like how are young people specifically, of course, all of us, not that many of us in the audience are that young anymore, but how are all of us processing, and specifically the group of folks in this film. Paul Higman asks, is there a correlation between religion and hope for the future? And I think you can answer that, any or all of you, and as well as like, how are you balancing, how are you and how are the people that you talk to in this film thinking about balancing what we know and what we see with hope? I guess maybe Taya will start with you and then see if Sarah and or Larissa have anything to add.
Yeah, I think cultural aspects are really important to a lot of the people that we talk to, and being able to include their own cultural background and the cultures and religions or whatever around their community as part of that influence in the climate movement, part of that building hope. So I do think that is an important element. And I think cultural sensitivity in this area is really important. And a lot of the Western ways that we've approached changing our future for the way that we're going currently with burning fossil fuels and a lot of the emissions, where they're coming from, is very swayed by Western culture, and the ways that we're approaching it with a lot of these conferences that are very male dominated, very like a little high up there in age usually as an average. And they're kind of coming out with not much solutions there. So I am seeing from the younger people a lot more hope that we can change things, but not through the structures that are currently kind of set up for us. And I think young people are usually very geared towards creating new structures and looking at things in a different way, because we haven't yet really been played into exactly how the world works so far. We're looking to change how the world works. So I think that a lot of the hope is stemming from community and cultural sensitivity, and really looking at different ways of approaching this. As Abe said in the film, like past the American dream, different ways of looking at past Western culture.
Awesome. I'm wondering, Larissa, I feel like we saw in the research a relationship between hope and taking action, right? I don't know if you want to talk about that one of the ways we can feel better about something is to do something about something, right? I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a growing, since we actually wrote the report, there's been growing amount of literature that's come out, like from Lorraine Whitmarsh and other groups that have shown that climate anxiety itself is really useful, and that it actually, our emotions are there to guide us, to tell us that something's wrong. And I think that's a good perspective too, to take if you're experiencing anxiety or grief. It's like, well, our emotions are there for a reason. They're there to point us in a direction, to tell us that something's wrong and raise red flag and say, hey, you got to do something about this. And the research that's been coming out has increasingly shown that climate anxiety is really helping to motivate people to do something about the problem, to take action. And hope often overlaps with climate anxiety. Oftentimes those positive emotions are really coexisting with more negative emotions of anxiety and grief.
Can I ask, just to jump in here for a second, I don't want to be negative, but we know that when you have expectations that are high, those high expectations could be the reason for negative, if they're not reached, then you can feel really bad. Is hope kind of a type of positive expectation that might lead to a crash or like a negative feeling? Is it possible for hope to be bad, or is it just good? I don't mean to be like a downer here.
Yeah, so I can take that on. I've done a lot of work looking at that, especially in like movements. And I think it's really important that we, and I don't love the metaphor, but that we focus on the we think about the battle and the war. I did a lot of work with a film-based campaign, a 10-year film-based campaign, or multi-film organization called Invisible Children, that wasn't focused on climate change. It was focused on ending genocide in Central Africa. And they had this saying after the first few films that was stop at nothing, celebrate everything. And so what they found is that if the sole focus was on ending this long-running 25-year war, that anything that we did that didn't end the war would just feel like a bummer. So instead they started focus, stop at nothing, celebrate everything. And so they'd build these mini campaigns. So like when John Kerry became Secretary of State, there was a campaign, a specific targeted campaign called Kerry Stop Coney. And the goal was to get John Kerry to speak out and say that he was going to prioritize this issue. And within I think 72 hours, he did that. And also cited this group and this effort. So this huge group of millions of youth activists felt efficacious, even though there wasn't. So I think there's this importance that we have to use it well. We have to connect action to outcome. If we say, do this and we'll save the planet, we know, and this also gets into Al Bandura's research on dual models of self-efficacy, right? That there's behavioral efficacy and response efficacy. Can I do it and will it matter? So if you say change your light bulbs and we good, earth good, then yes, we will attenuate hope because we know that that's not true. But if we say do this and this is a step, or I think this really gets back to what Taya was talking about, if we say the goal is for you to reconnect to what it means to be a human and reimagine the why underlying us being here, and that's not the capitalistic system. If your focus is living with the earth, not on the earth, if your focus is questioning, then you can succeed in that without any sort of parts per million or degree change outcome being hung on your actions. So I think that there is this paradigm shift with the way we think about hope and impact and what doing it or solving means.
One other, thank you, Beth, and I already wrote down that tagline. I'm like, can we use that?
It's great, right? Sure, they don't mind. There's no one that would share their taglines more than Invisible Children. They have a ton of great ones.
I mean, it makes total sense. And another thing, a person and a kind of body of work that's really influenced me is Joanna Macy, who has a book called Act of Hope, which I highly recommend. I could put a link to it in the chat, but it's, her book and her work is very much about working towards that vision that we want to create in the world. So I'm hopeful, I want to create XYZ, but I'm actively taking actions to do that. And of course, is that, it's not a false hope of I hope that we're going to be at blah, blah, blah. It's this is what I'm working towards. I'm not going to necessarily see this in my lifetime, but I'm planting the seeds and I'm doing my part to make that a reality. And if people don't have hope to guide their work, then you've lost everything. Then what is inspiring you to do anything if you don't have hope? So I think it's just it's very important. I think one other thing, just in terms of a little bit of I don't know, word choices here. There's a woman who's interning with us this semester. She's a student at the Columbia Climate School, grad school. And she's been saying to me, Sarah, I like the word courage instead of hope. And she's actually working on an essay about this and about how we all have to be courageous when it comes to the climate crisis. Everyone can do their part. Courage means different people to different people and will look different, but everyone needs to be courageous and take action to address the crisis.
Yeah. And I wanna go and kind of adding to this question. Therese said, I think it's so good not to just acknowledge the emotions and not feel alone. How do we deal? So we're talking about, thoughts on hope. And Therese says, how do we deal with anger at earlier generations, at inaction, at rich people, at the American lifestyle, at capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. So just throwing into the emotion pot, there's hope. And then there's also anger. Tay, I see you nodding. I don't know if you have any thoughts specifically from the Gen Z perspective, right? Like you inherited this, like, how do we balance not just hope, but anger? How do we make that productive?
I mean, this is something I struggle with. Even though I lecture on not doom scrolling through my phone, I wake up every morning and see 3 news clips that just make me want to scream. So it's definitely difficult to balance this anger that we're feeling. And I do think that there is a lot where Gen Z is, looking for what the problem was, but we're more focused on the solutions and what we want to do. So I think a lot of that anger has been channeled into youth-led activist movements like Sunrise, like Extinction Rebellion, like all these that are kind of popping up currently. There's also lawsuits like Juliana versus the US that are popping up, where it's really channeling that anger. And not every young person is going to start a lawsuit against their government. That's not the bar. That's not what we should be expecting out of young people currently. But there are a lot of places to channel that and use that anger towards action, like the anxiety. And the thing is, there is a broad spectrum of climate emotions, from anger and loss and depression and anxiety towards hope and optimism and love for nature, love for your surroundings, love for your community, climate joy. That all exists too. So I think being able to find these spaces where you can kind of be angry together, but also be looking at what we can do with this anger is really important there, especially for young people who are just feeling so lost. And I mean, even for me, just having an environmental club in high school where I could just talk to people about, like, this is messed up, man. Like, it's helpful to just be able to talk about it as well.
Yeah. I wonder, Larissa, that makes me think about the framework. I want to just take 1 minute, as moderator privilege. There was there was a question earlier, about which we got at, and about, religion and hope. And Sarah mentioned interfaith power and light. I'm just going to throw in, and I just want to take a moment because a beautiful, amazing, powerful, intelligent, kind, caring member of our BECC community who we lost way too young at the age of 40. Dina Biscotti was actually doing research on interfaith power and light and on the role of religion and religious organizations. We lost her way too soon. But I'm just going to throw in just one a YouTube video of a talk she gave in 2013, shortly before we lost her, who was doing a lot of this important work, and there still are others. So I just wanted to kind of like, when I saw you write interfaith power and light, like Dina and all her amazing work, and the power of the BECC community to bring people together and bring ideas like this together, just came to me. And I just wanted to kind of give Dina a little beautiful shout out, because I miss her a lot. And she was profound, in the ideas that I think we're 10 years later still starting to think about. Like, she was like, religion and climate change are inextricably, like, why are they at odds? They shouldn't be, if you look at the underpinnings of like faith and religion. And so, like, anybody who wants to pick that thread up and run with it, like, we haven't seen a lot in the past 10 years, I think, in this BECC community since we lost Dina. So check out her work, check out Interfaith Power and Light, and consider doing research and really leveling that work up. And then I also wanted to, I said less than a minute, it was more because I talk a lot. But Larissa, I think Taya was talking about like not just anger, what can attenuate those negative, how can we process those emotions, process through them? Taya, you mentioned several things that are in the framework, right? Actually engaging in nature experiences, sharing stories and climate emotions, taking climate action. I know we just have a few minutes left. And there are a few more questions there, but Larissa, do you want to kind of give a quick summary to that, to those elements that we can use with ourselves, with our communities, with our children, with our programs?
So when we were doing the report that I mentioned earlier, we wanted to figure out, what can we do about this? And we're researchers, so we looked at the literature, and they're really, we wanted to know, what can we do with all these emotions that we're experiencing? Like, what can we do about this grief and the depression and the anxiety, and how do we sleep better at night and cope with the emotions in a way that can help us kind of, not be debilitated by them, but be able to kind of act and harness them in a positive way. And so we looked to the literature, and what we found was that there were kind of 6 evidence-based strategies for coping with climate anxiety that seemed to be effective based on existing research. And the first one is really the first step is really just acknowledging and facing your feelings. Dan Siegel, famous neuropsychologist, some of you may know, says, name it to tame it. Just naming our emotions, and there's so much research on, from Matt Lieberman and others, that just naming and labeling your negative emotions can in and of itself reduce those emotions, and as well as activation in emotional, in the neural regions associated with those emotions, like the amygdala. And so just kind of facing those emotions is the first real step. And the second is that there's these, emotion coping tools that we can use, things like mindfulness. There was a study that just came out that showed that in post-disaster survivors, that mindfulness-based therapy seemed to be effective for helping reduce psychiatric symptoms and psychological symptoms in people who had undergone Katrina and the Gulf oil spill. And also, in terms of these emotional coping tools, Carolyn Hickman, I think, is a great thinker in this area. And she talks about really reframing our emotions. So not thinking, that when we say climate anxiety, that really is engaging the rhetoric of pathology. It sounds like something is wrong with you, that there's something that is wrong. But really, reframing that to recognize that if you're experiencing anxiety or grief about what's happening to the planet, it's because you care. It's because you're a compassionate person, you're an empathic person. And so she suggests, not saying climate anxiety, but calling it climate compassion or climate empathy, and recognizing that these emotions are natural and shared by a lot of people all around the world, and not pathological, but actually a really rational response to the situation that we're in. The third thing that we talked about, or that we found in the literature, was social connection can be really powerful. There's just a massive amount of literature on the power of social support and social connection to buffer people from stress in many different kind of contexts, and one of them being in climate change related disasters. For example, people, disaster survivors, there's been shown, I think it was after Katrina, that they showed that people with higher perceived social support had lower psychological issues post-disaster. And so that can mean kind of talking to people in your community about, or your family and friends about your feelings. It's also could be engaging in one of these community groups that exist. There's a lot of resources out there now that have developed, the Climate Awakening circles, All We Can Save circles, Good Grief Network. There's kind of community groups that can help you connect with other people and process your emotions, if that's a good fit. Also, getting into nature. There's, that's kind of number 4 in our framework, that nature, being in nature can calm the nervous system, lower stress, reduce rumination, and has a powerful effect on the nervous system in general. And kind of the 5th, I don't know if I'm running out of time, but the 5th and probably the most efficient is engaging in climate action, because it's not just reducing our distress, but it's also, doing that by targeting the underlying source of the distress, which is climate change. So it's helping climate change and then reducing distress at the same time. And it really can, engaging in climate action can really help combat the kind of helplessness that's really kind of at the center of a lot of our emotions about climate change, and give us a sense of agency and empowerment. And the last one I'll say really briefly is self-care. That a lot of, Taya talked about the kind of burnout that we can see a lot with people that are kind of engaged consistently with climate action. And so it's really important to balance climate action with, going for a run and taking care of yourself, doing things that make you feel good and generate positive emotions. And we know that elements of like exercise, for example, is really powerful for stress reduction. So
Awesome. Thank you, Larissa. And I just wanted to share, I'm going to share one more resource, another member of the BECC community and the psychology community that does a lot of this research on this, that Reuven and Larissa and I are all a part of, the American Psychological Association. Thomas Doherty, there was a great New York Times article featuring Thomas and his work on climate change, anxiety, and therapy. And there's something that just stuck with me from reading that. And he is talking about this mother and her daughter, and she's like, what about her? She has no future. And he just said, and I just kept telling, and I told her, or the woman said, he just told me, and it really helped me. Remember, you'll have good days. She'll have good days. You'll still have good days. And that stuck with me since I read that, like that when it seems hopeless, like the same thing if someone had cancer diagnosis, right? Like this is bad and we'll still have good days. I wonder, we're almost at time. I want to invite, if any of the speakers have a very brief closing remark or comment, anything that you want to leave us with, please do. Thank you. Sarah and Thomas has this great podcast. Any final words, comments from our speakers before I turn it back to Reuven?
I just really want to quickly say just thank you to everyone for these really thoughtful questions, and Beth for your awesome leading us here. And I mean, I know this is redundant, but it's these types of conversations that we need, because we're all in this together, and we're not going to be able to do this alone, and we can't process our emotions alone. And the more we talk about it, and the more we normalize it, and the more it's okay to just say, I have climate anxiety, the better we're going to be in terms of how we all feel and how we're able to engage in the climate crisis.
Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for being a leader in the space, seeing a need in the world, creating the Climate Mental Health Network. I encourage everyone to check out their work. Taya, and your films and storytelling, and being willing to put in the work and be vulnerable. Larissa leading all this research. And really, if anyone's like, she is an encyclopedia, I know, it's amazing. Like Larissa can just cite off, knows the space so well, and is leveraging that knowledge to really help us process both cognitively and emotionally. And thank you all for taking the time. I know this is not, we had talked about a lot of wonky stuff in the BECC community, and not as much about like just processing emotions and climate anxiety. So thank you all for taking the time to be here, regardless of your job or institution or organization. And with that, I'll turn back over to you, Reuven, for final goodbye.
Thanks, Beth. These are important conversations, and I'm delighted we could have the BECC community, talk about this stuff. And I wanted to just close by saying, please register for our next free webinar, really about behavior change. And this one is particularly about weathercasters and how they can have an impact on climate change belief and action. Ed Maybach is sort of a giant in this space, and it'll be great to hear from him. So within the next week, you'll see a registration link for the next webinar. You can register for that. It'll be May 17th. And of course, I hope to see you all at the BECC conference in person. That'll be November 12th to 15th. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.